Welcome to Safe and Safe Country podcast. Here we discuss people, decisions and events which are important for safety and future. We seek answers on how to win the Russian-Ukrainian war, keep our country, Ukraine, free, strong and independent. I'm Alina Frolova, and this podcast is our joint project with the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda and Media Center Ukraine. We are now in the timeline when the President Trump already get into the office, started to implement the program which he claimed, and everyone in this world just looking at him and in decisions which he's making, speeches which he's making, trying to understand what would be the future of the principal strategic, geostrategic issues, including Ukraine-Russian war. I would like to speak about the vision from United States of what's going on and what are the prognoses for this year with my guest, military analyst, senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Michael Kofman. Hi, Michael.
Hi. Thanks for having me back on your program.
Yeah, we actually met 1 year ago, in almost 1 year ago, and we've been speaking about how we see the 2024s. So maybe I will start from one of the scenario which we discussed last year, as a vision for 2024, and we will try to evaluate whether it happened or not. So you said that the one of positive scenarios for 2024 could be window of opportunities. Ukraine is able to mount an effective defense. It's able to hold the Russian military and exhaust a lot of offensive potential at the peak of Russian defense spending. Possible because the Russian advantages from your point of view are not decisive enough. They are there, but you shouldn't assume that they are going to just translate into battlefield victories. Ukraine is able to use this time, Western countries, to focus on defense industrial capacity, to consolidate the force, and to invest in the capabilities that will present Ukraine with significant advantages by 2025. Looking back, what do you think? Do we see realization of this scenario, or the year went in the wrong direction?
I think that we ended up maybe somewhere in the middle of those predictions. I think the worst case scenarios for 2024 didn't take place. The front didn't collapse. There wasn't a major Russian breakthrough anywhere along the front line. The Russian military wasn't able to take any of the most significant cities. Some of the Russian offensives, like the Kharkiv offensive, failed visibly. And we still don't know how the winter will turn out in looking at Ukrainian critical infrastructure, because there's still quite a bit of winter to go. But so far, it's also not been the worst case scenario when we look at the damage Russia inflicted on Ukraine's power generation capacity. On the other hand, I do think that the year very much went in the wrong direction. And I think the war's been on a negative trajectory since about fall of 2023, to be honest with you. I think the best case scenarios didn't take place either. To some extent, Ukraine was able to hold Russia to incremental gains last year. Ukraine had a tactically successful offensive in Kursk, although I think the potential operational gains or even perhaps more strategic benefits of that offensive had not been realized. And we can circle back to that topic if you like. Mm-hmm. But I think that we're entering 2025 with Ukraine in a very difficult position. There are some very glaring structural issues in terms of Ukraine's manpower, mobilization, force management decisions that were made last year that I think could have been a lot better. And if we look at the overall funding situation and prospects for sustained Western support, Ukraine certainly faces an uncertain future this year. And you can well debate whether or not what we're going to see in the next 6 months, you can't see a year out in a conventional war. You're very lucky if you're even seeing a couple months out in a conventional war like this. It's very difficult to predict events. For example, I would have had no way of predicting that Ukraine was going to do the Kursk offensive. Mm-hmm. And I think it was just as surprising for most people in Ukraine as it was for those of us Absolutely. Watching it from afar. And I go to Ukraine every couple of months. So, of the analysts who do this work, I've been to the front line and across much of the front line. that I tend to survey about every 3.5 months, typically. You have to do that. First, if you're not there, if you don't see what the fight actually looks like, then it's very difficult to have a sense of it. And second, you have to go to different parts of the front line each time, because what the fight is like, maybe in Kupiansk is not the same situation in Chasiv Yar or by Pokrovsk, right? Or the current fight happening in Kursk. There's different terrain, different battles, and the situation's different there. So you need to have a good sense of these. Sorry for the detour. So I think where that takes me is that Ukraine was not able to stabilize the front line last year. Russia was making gains at an accelerated rate from July to December, meaning each month Russia was taking more territory than the month before. Now, if you're looking at the overall amount of territory they took, this is very, very small percentages. But that should offer cold comfort, because this war is not going to be decided by who controls the next 10 kilometers of Donetsk. This is not a war about Pokrovsk or who controls Pokrovsk, right? This war ultimately will be decided by, at least on the battlefield, by whether or not the Ukrainian military can stabilize the front line and exhaust Russian forces and exhaust Russian offensive potential, and then impose sufficient costs on Russia in terms of long-range strike and other capabilities to compel Russia to a negotiating table. Naturally, the prospect of Western sanctions and other things can be an added factor, but sanctions are not going to decide this war. And I'm deeply skeptical that the Russian economy is going to decide this war this year either. I don't hang a lot of hopes on that. I think that ultimately the situation on the battlefield has to be addressed, and the problems there have to deal much more with the fundamentals. The Ukrainian military got a lot better tactically over the course of last year, but tactical innovation, adaptation, and being much better than the Russians at the tactical level is not sufficient to compensate for challenges with the fundamentals.
Yeah, and if we will look from this point and coming back to Kursk and problems with the force management in Ukraine, yes, how you will prognose what could happen? Yeah, because here we see obviously that Russian offensive is like a very strange manner is for Western people, for example. Yes, they just use the manpower to move forward, which is not acceptable for most of the armies, but they still do it. And obviously from one point of view, we see that the like a line of operation, active operation, is much squeezier than it was before. It's almost like a 25%, 30% less. Russia cannot make an offensive at other directions, but still they're on offensive. Many analysts here and in Western countries, they said that this is like some kind of political move. They try to gain the good position before negotiation. They try to demonstrate that they are strong enough to dominate at negotiation table. Then like some kind of military logic behind. How do you see this situation, and what are your prognoses for the next period?
So first, regarding how Russia actually uses forces, right? You see that the war, to some extent, had forced both sides to employ forces in very small packets, that is, dispersed infantry assaults. Russians tend to alternate between assaults with small fire teams and employing assault groups of typically 6 to 8 men and fire teams of 3 to 5 men. Light sort of motorized tactics, trying to move up soldiers to get better position with ATVs, motorcycles, what have you, and mechanized assaults. And they actually do conduct mechanized assaults still regularly in the size of maybe a company or more, depending on where you look at the front. And they cycle between these tactics, okay? The reason for that is, first, is very difficult to overcome a prepared defense. Western militaries are oriented towards maneuver warfare, but most of the concepts and the tactics are really developed for a high-intensity period of warfare in the initial period of war. That is what the Russia-Ukraine war looked like in the first month. If I was to show you February, 24th to March 25th, it looked like that. And it also looked a bit like that maybe in April to May as well. But conventional wars, if they become prolonged wars, have these lengthy phases of positional warfare and attrition as both sides reconstitute. The force quality degrades. You lose the initial army you started the war with. Neither the Russian nor Ukrainian army today looked remotely the way they did when the war began. And unfortunately, actually, many of the people themselves are gone, right? If you look back to who was there in 2022, Russia lost the better part of its army actually in the first several weeks during that failed initial operation, and then struggled to recover for a very long time. Whereas Ukraine had a huge influx of volunteers, people who were veterans and had experience that lined up and really expanded Ukrainian forces in 2022. And this was a motivated army. This was an army with veterancy, with experience. And this was an army that was actually, felt and looked like it was winning the war in 2022. Yeah. Anybody listening to this knows the story well, and I'm not going to tell to Ukrainian colleagues their own history. Today, the challenge that both forces have is that technology and tactics have made it very hard to overcome a well-prepared defense, right? Where you have fortifications, you have minefields, but on top of that, you have drones. You have a plethora of strike drones on both sides, where both sides are producing maybe 1 million, 1.5 million drones per year now, if you're just looking at first-person view strike drones. And so it's very hard to engage in any kind of maneuver operation without taking big losses. Russians, last time they really tried a major operation like that was the initial assault on Avdiivka in October 2023 and went very badly for them. And in the battle for Avdiivka from October to February, they lost easily an army's worth of equipment. And because a lot of the Russian equipment is still coming out of storage, they quickly saw that they can't afford more operations like that. Meaning if they try to win that way, they're going to drain the rest of what they have in storage very quickly. And they're essentially living off the Soviet legacy and Soviet inheritance of equipment that's there. And the Soviet Union does not exist anymore for them to build this equipment again, right? So they understand that they're dealing with material constraints. And those material constraints will be quite visible, particularly in the second half of this year. They're not going to run out of equipment, but part of the reason they have to rely much more on dismounted infantry attack or light motorized tactics is because they have to manage equipment losses. But the other reason is also because of the nature of the battlefield. Because force quality issues, right? You can replace quantity. The Russian military has been contracting at a fairly high rate. Russian recruitment went back up in the second half of last year. And I actually worry it's going to go up again, very much in the first half of this year. The reason for that is if people expect that the war might end sometime this year, right? Many Russians might sign up, take the bonus payouts are 5-6 times now what they were in 2023, thinking that they're only going to be fighting for 6 months, right? So there might be a lot of people in Russia who now think that they're sort of the smart ones. They waited till 2025. They're going to get the signing bonus and they're only going to go to war for a couple months compared to the people who took, contracts and took bonuses back in 2023 and 2024, right? So they might even have this effect. I don't know if that's the case, but the massive amount of money that they are paying to hire people did show some results for sure in 2024. And so they're still able to sustain this rate of loss. The rate of loss was very high if you look at September, October, November, December for Russian forces. All right, so part of that is just a conversation on nature of the battlefield, and because the Ukrainian military is very good at defending. Like Ukrainian military, despite the shortage of infantry, is using drones effectively as a force multiplier and is doing a very good job at defending and has gotten much better tactically if you just compare how the force is performing in 2024 versus 2023. On political implications or motivations. Part of the Russian goal is clearly still to take Donetsk. That's one of their minimal goals in Ukraine. And so part of their objective is the territory itself. But wars are fundamentally contests of wills. And you have a sense of who lost or won the war when you see the settlement. And there you can see who imposed the will upon whom. And it's clear that the broader Russian goal still is to destroy Ukraine as a functional state. Now, my own view, and I don't think anybody knows this for certain, right? At the end of the day, it comes down to Putin, and I don't live in his head, and I've never written an article with the title of what Putin really wants, because I don't know. But there are articles like that out there, but I don't claim to possess special knowledge here. I think that in the opening operation, we have very good knowledge of what the Russian plans and intentions were, which were to install a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine and to occupy most of, if not all of Ukraine. I think subsequently, what Moscow wants is to destroy Ukraine as a viable state, as an independent state, and one that's economically viable, and ultimately to impose its will on Ukraine, that is, limit Ukrainian sovereignty. And we can see that in the demands they are still making that go back to the demands they were making in Istanbul, Weimar Republic-style restrictions on Ukrainian military, what have you. I don't think that they necessarily still aspire or think that they have any chance of installing a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine, that is, they're not going to return to Kiev. And their military performance in this war is simply not commensurate with their political demands. If you look at Russia's maximalist aims, it's very difficult to see how their military performance is going to get them there. Regarding positioning for negotiations, yes, well, naturally in a war, what happens on the battlefield dictates each side's hand and the leverage they have. But nobody knows when negotiations are going to happen. Russia's clearly stalling because they have a better alternative to negotiation, which is to keep fighting. They're going to have to be compelled to negotiate. They're happy to meet to talk, right, with the Trump administration, but willing to talk and willing to negotiate are two different things. Meaning Moscow is happy to have the optics of meeting with the United States to talk, to have a summit. But they are also visibly stalling because they think that the war is going their way. And unless that changes, you're either not going to get a negotiation from them, or the negotiation will be them essentially demanding capitulation, right? You are not going to get a negotiation on favorable terms, or the way things increasingly are trending, I have to be very honest, on acceptable terms. And I think that at the very least, that has to be the minimal aim of this war, which is to get war termination on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. And secondarily, we have a whole other set of negotiations between Ukraine and the West. The first order negotiation is not between Russia and Ukraine. It's between Ukraine and the West. It's about what kind of security guarantees Ukraine can expect, right? Or alternatively, if it can't expect security guarantees, what can it expect from the West? Because everybody understands that whatever deal is made with Russia is not going to be worth the paper it's on. It will lead to a rearmament period, very likely. And then Russia may renew combat operations, but this time they will not have the ridiculous plan that they had when they first invaded, thinking that they were going to very easily conduct a coup de main, that the conditions were set for a speedy takeover of Ukraine, the way the operation was run, actually, in February of 2022. This time they might come back with a very different operation and having, had the experience in this war. And so I understand why everyone I know in Ukraine is very much worries that any ceasefire with Russia will simply lead to a third war and a rearmament period on the Russian side.
You mentioned second half of 2025 as the possible period when Russia will exhaust in equipment. We also see a lot of prognosis with economic troubles which Russia is facing. The hidden dynamic is a very non-positive, let's say so. The inflation is in accordance with the even official now statements more than 20%. We see the changes in banking system. We see the changes in many things which are actually declare that they have crucial problems which won't be solved with any decisions in the nearest future. We also see this latest decision of Biden administration about the transportation and blockage of the transportation of oil and gas, how in short period they influence positively, let's say so. So all that creates a lot of expectation for the second part of the 2025, when we could see the mixture of all these factors which could lead to the weakening of the position of Russia. At the same time, we really have this a suspended view because we don't know what United States will do. And the Europe is of great concerns. Ukraine, of course, is of great concerns. And this a strategic ambiguity which creates a lot of variance of how we can influence the situation now, how Europe can influence the situation now, how expert community can influence now. So what about the second half? And by the way, just to tell you that now the bonus signing, which you mentioned, subscribing of the contracts, decreased almost in 5 times for the last half a year. Although the bonus increased to some tremendous amount of $50,000 for subscribing the contract, still the subscription is going down very seriously. And there are, again, the discussions about whether Russia will claim the total mobilization or not among the population, which doesn't seem very realistic. But it means that they have lack of manpower on the battlefield too for the next period. So what are your ideas about this mysterious second half of the 2025?
Okay, that's a lot of questions on different topics. So let's try to pick some of them up at the first time. First, I don't agree that Russia has a lack of manpower right now. I'm just sorry. On the basis of the numbers, I don't agree. Moscow is not Russia, and all of Russians don't live in Moscow. So Russians primarily recruit from the regions. The areas where they don't get people are Moscow and St. Petersburg, because that's where people are the least likely to be attracted by the money offered. So the money that's being paid out is obviously not very attractive to a person who has sufficient income to live in Moscow, but it's going to be much more attractive to somebody else in Russia.
They had this situation because many people were coming from regions to sign the contract in Moscow because it was like a higher payment. And this is something which also demonstrates the regional influence.
Yeah, I think that at some point, they may run into an issue where they've already contracted all the people that are willing to take the money, and no amount of money is enough. That is true. However, we have not seen it yet. And we've not seen them have the kind of manpower issues that would force any kind of additional partial mobilization. And they have been able to sustain these losses. And more importantly, they didn't just sustain losses. They spent 2 years expanding the force. The Russian ground force is much larger now than it was at the beginning of the war. The initial force that invaded Ukraine in the full-scale invasion of 2022 was actually fairly small and brittle compared to the force currently deployed. I don't know if they will be able to sustain the rate of losses that they have suffered in the fall. But it's also important to look at the facts, which is that while they're probably not contracting sufficiently to keep expanding the force, they have been contracting enough generally to replace the losses. Maybe that won't continue. And the conversation on constraints, I think, needs to be one that doesn't use the word exhaust. Russians are not going to run out of people or equipment. What they may very well run out of is the ability to sustain this intensity of offensive pressure. The challenge that I've seen is that the way Russia is fighting, while they're not able to achieve operationally significant breakthroughs, they can't generate both a breakthrough, then exploit it and have momentum on the battlefield. They've essentially traded that off for maintaining pressure and sustaining offensive pressure on Ukraine along several parts of the front consistently over the course of a year. And they can probably keep doing that for months to come, right? Because they're just rotating regiments and they're replacing losses, contracting people within a few weeks of the contract, putting the people back on the front line. And they're fighting with a small part of the force because they're primarily using assault groups supported by the equipment or the units that they're given to. And they're essentially cycling through these assault groups and then rotating the regiment out, putting another regiment on the line. How long they can keep doing this is anybody's guess, but it's important to go back to 2024 because I think the expectation was overly optimistic that they would be exhausted come fall, and that's clearly not the case. We'll see what happens this year. There was a slowdown in Russian operations in December to January, but a lot of that has to do with weather and other factors. We have to see if those trends are going to be sustained. But this is my general sense that they've essentially made a big trade-off, seeing that they cannot conduct big successful operations. So they're simply using their resource advantage to apply pressure and steadily pressing their way through the front. That said, look, even though they're not, let's say, not that effective or the force quality isn't there for them to be much more effective, if Ukraine does not address its manpower situation, if the cohesion of the defense keeps going down because units are fighting with lots of attachments and everybody else's forces are being attached to a commander, and the overall level of organization and cohesion does improve at the front line, you could still see a collapse of the front line, not because the Russians are particularly good, but because at a certain point, you cannot just hold the front line with drones. Ukraine is rightfully expanding drone units, going from battalions now to regiments and what have you, because it's the main part of the force that is the principal force multiplier, helping forces basically compensate for lack of manpower. But at a certain point, you can see that the trend line isn't positive, and it very much needs to be reversed. Regarding the economic question, there's to some extent a debate. Russia has very visible economic problems, and the cracks are getting greater and greater. The war is not sustainable for them from an economic perspective. That's clear. If you look at the big issues in the Russian economy, I have a colleague, Alexander Prokopenko at our Berlin Center, who writes quite a bit about this, that they essentially have been trying to balance along three big aspects of the economy, and that they face a trilemma. And at this point this year, it looks like the Russian economy is steadily exhausting itself, more so than the military effort, because they might face stagflation, where the economy is both stagnating and has a high rate of inflation. On the one hand, you have high levels of government spending on the war that's driving inflation. You have the government competing both for people to work in the defense industry and contracting men to fight at the front. This is a huge problem because Russia has functionally almost no unemployment and a big deficit of skilled labor in general. Plus, the Russian economy is fairly labor intensive. That is, Russia's always had a problem of very low productivity relative to a Western country. Right? So you have a low productivity, labor intensive industry, a deficit of labor. They're contracting men to try to replace loss at the front and also to get folks in the defense sector. And this is essentially all pouring gasoline on the inflation problem that they have. And the central bank is trying to firefight the inflation from the other side, raising interest rate to well over 20% now, which they can't sustain for very long, because I don't know any economy that can sustain a base interest rate for over 20% for very long. Or at least we're about to find out to see what that looks like for them. And the central bank is doing this because central bank only controls a part of the lending, because the government is financing a lot of this effort. So central bank is only able to affect a part of the Russian economy, right? So the rate, they're trying to raise the base lending rate well above the rate of inflation because, to some extent, the government is competing with itself in these efforts. Okay. The challenge is that they're entering a period of crisis, but they can probably sustain this for some time. And they can go for a period of stagflation for some time. I can't predict the impact of sanctions. Sanctions are going to cap Russian revenue from oil sales to an extent. But one of the biggest factors that we can't really predict very well is what will be the price of oil this year, because that's the principal source of revenue generation for the Russian state. I do not think that the United States can affect it that much, despite proclamations that I see coming out of the Trump administration, because they simply don't align with what you see in energy markets, or at least what I know. And I'm not an economist or an energy expert, and I want to be upfront about this. But it is very difficult to see how the price of oil will be dramatically lowered to a price that will prove cataclysmic for Russia, which has to be around $45 per barrel or less. All right. Simply because first, for U.S. shale production, the break-even price is $65 per barrel, and the profit price has to be around $75. And for countries Saudi Arabia, their budget break-even price is around $100 per barrel. So I don't see them wanting to basically shoot themselves in both feet and drop the price of oil per barrel so much lower than the break-even point for their government budget, if that makes sense. I'm a little skeptical on it, but this is a very notional view. I'm not an expert on energy, so I'm just kind of thinking about it, and I doubt we'll see the price crash to the point that's going to be deterministic this year. So the bottom line, from my point of view, yes, the state of the Russian economy is probably their biggest weakness. It's hard to make predictions on what that will look like in the latter half of the year. I do think that for Moscow, if they're not winning the war decisively this year and by the middle of this year, then they are in deep trouble, and they know that too. And that their negotiating position and that their hand is actually a lot weaker than it looks relative to their demands, right? To the things that they're trying to achieve in this war. But I think it is wishful thinking to believe that the Russian economy will be the most deterministic factor this year. And I think people who are hinging their hopes on the fact that despite how the war is going, that the Russian economy is going to somehow collapse and force Russia to negotiate, it's possible, but I'm deeply skeptical. And I'll be honest, having worked on this for quite a few years now, I've heard the story before. In fact, I heard it back in 2022. I heard it after 2014. And if you've been doing this for some time too, and you're listening to this, then you've probably heard the story several times before yourself of how the Russian economy is going to collapse. They're going to run out of reserves, and this is going to solve the Russia problem for us. And maybe it will. But I'm deeply skeptical. I think we're going to have, let's put it this way, I think we're going to have to solve it ourselves. And we cannot simply sit back and hope that the Russian economy will prove the solution to this war.
Yes, but speaking about their opportunity for this first part of the year for like a better position in negotiations or on battlefield, I'd like to ask your personal opinion about future negotiations. Do you see them possible? Do you see any like a kind of possibility for success of this negotiation? Because the interesting thing is that, for example, there is a survey conducted by Ipsos and where they asked people from different countries whether they believe that conflict in Ukraine will end up in 2025. And the average answer is no. And the positive answer, like a hope for this end of this conflict, is quite high, like a 59% in China, Indonesia, India. But the lowest expectation are in European countries. Japan, 14%, Netherlands, 15%, and negative attitude around like a 75, 60% in Europe and all those countries who like can make any difference. So principally, people do not believe that this war can be ended up in 2025. At the same time, like many politicians, including Trump administration, here we come to your evaluation of what's going on with Trump administration towards their position of war in Ukraine. So do you see any possibility for negotiations? And do you see any possibility for these negotiations to be successful?
Yeah. So first, a comment on prediction markets. I remember in fall of 2021, as one of the people was saying that this war was going to happen and that Russia was going to conduct a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, all the predictions markets were saying that this wasn't going to happen. Okay? Mm-hmm. And people were even yelling at me back then that I was basically negatively affecting the bond spread and other things by suggesting that the war was coming. And while predictions markets can often be good and better than experts, just so folks appreciate this, experts actually tend not to be that great in predictions in their own fields. It's to some degree a paradox of expertise. Journalists often do better in predictions than people who are subject matter experts. And it's ironic because people look to experts to make predictions, but they're often much better at explaining what's going on or what happened, or giving, more importantly, people a way to think about the problem rather than giving them the answer. So it's often a question of, do you want the answer to the prediction, or do you want a way to think about the problem that helps you make the decisions you want to make? So, my own experience, I'm pretty skeptical of predictions markets, and I'm not particularly concerned in what people think is going to, like, whether they think negotiations are going to happen this year. That's just my own view. For a simple reason. There's just a great asymmetry of information, right? And so folks often, I think, don't necessarily have the basis for the prediction they need to make on some specific topics. Yeah, there's going to be a negotiation because wars end in negotiations. I think that's almost 100% certainty. Will the negotiations actually end the war is a big question mark, or will they simply lead to a pause that leads to a third war? Right now, I suspect more the latter, depending on how it goes. Will there be negotiations this year? Yes, very likely. In fact, what's interesting is you can see the behavior of most parties suggest that they expect negotiations to take place this year, and probably even the first half of this year. Now, will they be successful? I don't know, because I don't know what success means. So let's discuss a little bit what does success mean. Successful for whom?
Well, yeah.
Because successful for Ukraine, successful for the United States, and successful for Russia are three potentially very different outcomes.
Absolutely. But at least whether they will lead to something.
I mean, they can lead to something, but they can also lead to something Ukraine doesn't want and doesn't like. So we should be frank and open-eyed about what the negotiations could result in, because it depends on the hand you have in the position you're in when you arrive at the negotiating table. They could very well lead to a ceasefire. I suspect that's now the likeliest outcome. I don't know that they can lead to an unconditional ceasefire. There might be conditions attached. And I also don't know what the West is going to offer Ukraine in terms of material support, maybe forces deployed in Ukraine following any ceasefire. Security guarantees from the United States now look very unlikely to me. Certainly, that's my reading of the Trump administration and their public messaging. I see now a great deal of misalignment between what Ukrainian public statements are regarding the need for security guarantees from the United States and where the Trump administration is. I don't know, maybe that'll change, but that's just my reading of the situation. Regarding Europeans, so this is one of the most interesting questions, because the United States will increasingly be looking to Europe, both to take a greater share of the burden for this war in terms of financial assistance and material support, but also when we look at training of Ukrainian forces. And Europe actually last year began to take on more and more of the training mission. when we look at the broader package security assistance. Also supplying ammunition. Europe always had a lot higher rate of artillery production than the United States did, but only a percentage of this artillery output was ever bought and sent to Ukraine. And even then, belatedly. And even then, it took the Czechs and others to cobble together an initiative to buy ammunition from within and outside of Europe last year to help rectify the fires asymmetry that we saw on the front line last year. So I think expectations are also high that Europeans are going to take on a much greater role in supporting Ukraine and sustaining the Ukrainian military if there's any settlement or armistice. And Europeans look increasingly worried that they're going to have to take on a more autonomous role. But as I've said in a discussion with a colleague, I think earlier this week or maybe last week, I think they will surprise themselves once they realize that in some areas they cannot rely on the United States.
Absolutely, yes. And this is for Ukraine, it's good because the Europe finally started to be more active and conscious about the threat which is coming. And they put a lot of efforts, and that's obvious, and that gives a lot of hopes. But yeah, it's difficult times for them, and we all acknowledge. Okay, to finalize our conversation, in accordance with our tradition, try to describe the best scenario or good scenario for this year, what we will see in the beginning of 2026, and not good scenario. And we'll see what will happen.
Okay, let's consider what the potential trajectories are that this war could take this year. Best case scenario, from my point of view, and I think we had the similar conversation early last year, right? That's what we started our conversation with, kind of the scenarios we discussed for 2024. So best case scenario, Ukraine is able to address its manpower situation, not solve everything, but I do see finally positive trends. First, suspending the creation of new brigades, ideally disbanding some of them. I think it would be even better to disband the rest of the 160, 150 series, to be perfectly honest. I think making those brigades, given Ukraine's manpower situation, the pressure Ukraine faced at the front, and depletion of manning levels among the experienced units last year was a puzzling decision. I like the personnel choices I see with Drapata being assigned as Land Forces Commander and Osov Commander and Apostol and others, finally maybe addressing basic training in Ukraine in the third year of the war, and how poor basic training is and how demoralizing that is for a lot of people, especially folks who think that they might go into infantry, see infantry combat almost as a one-way ticket. And even if they were motivated, by the time they're through basic training and they see what that's like, they might not be motivated after that. To me, I do see some positive developments finally in terms of the folks that are taking on leadership roles. So Ukraine has a shot at stabilizing the front line and at steadily exhausting Russia's offensive potential this year. And if it can hold Russia to incremental gains, avoid a collapse of the front, which I want to highlight was avoided last year, right? The worst case scenario did not come true last year. And by the summer when I was in Ukraine in June, I could tell that the collapse of the front line was unlikely. The problem was that the positive trends we saw for a couple of months, if you look at Ukrainian mobilization, at the situation in the summer, were not sustained. Mobilization failed. I think that's just the reality. And the force management choices, some of the other choices that were made, I think, led to a situation where Ukraine was still steadily losing. And I think that there is still the opportunity to reverse this trajectory. Second, Ukraine expands the strike campaign. I think with our support and our financial investment in Ukraine's defense industrial production last year, we saw Ukraine substantially expand the number of long-range strike drones it was making, but also its own types of ground-launched cruise missiles of various types. And that's going to really significantly increase Ukraine's ability to inflict damage on Russian infrastructure. That by itself is not a war-winning strategy. Long-range strike in the deep battle is not going to solve for the problem at the front line. It's going to require both Ukraine stabilizing the front, developing better capacity for operational strike at around 30 kilometers to 200 kilometers behind the depth of the front, but also expanding this long-range strike capacity. So this combination of measures could force Russia to the negotiating table once they see diminishing returns, right? And the costs keep going up. And they see that they're not winning decisively, meaning they're not able to convert their material advantage to any kind of decisive outcome on the battlefield. And they face a very shaky economic picture as we get later into 2025. You could see that as a positive outcome. And then ultimately that leads you to the negotiating table where Ukraine tries to achieve an end to the war on favorable terms, or barring that, at least acceptable terms. Terms that don't fundamentally compromise Ukrainian security, terms that don't lead Ukraine to a situation where people say, what was the point of fighting this war if this is actually the outcome and the terms we have to accept? That I think would be probably one of the best case scenarios. I know there's other folks out there that still talk about retaking all the territory, getting to Crimea. Sorry, I'm not there and I haven't been there since summer of 2023 because I was there during the offensive in July of summer 2023 and I saw how that went, right? And I was there again in the fall of 2023. And I think that Ukraine could hold the hope of taking back a lot of territory in the negotiating table, at the political process. But I'm skeptical looking at the trend lines that this is realistic right now. Maybe I'm wrong. And of course, ideally, I'm also wrong about Russia's manpower situation, and maybe they run into manpower issues a lot sooner this year than I anticipate. In general, Ukraine has proven more resilient, and I think folks actually thought that the situation might be worse come January than it is right now. Ukraine is still holding on to maybe 30% plus of Kursk. Pokrovsk hasn't been taken, and despite the negative trends, I don't think it's gone nearly as badly as folks might have anticipated. Let's talk worst case scenario. Manpower situation isn't addressed. Manning levels continue to decline, especially in infantry. Ukrainian efforts to cannibalize the force, transfer support personnel, air defense personnel to infantry only makes the situation worse. Sorry, I don't think that you can take people who operate manpads, who are experienced air defense people, and then throw them into infantry roles. I mean, you can, but this is a stopgap measure. It's not going to solve the problem. That's just my own opinion. That's one analyst's point of view. And eventually you see either in southern Donetsk or if Russian forces enter Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which they're barely a couple kilometers from, you see a part of the front collapse. And then the Russian rate of gain is just much higher. They're not able to achieve a big breakthrough. No, they don't easily drive to Pavlograd or to Dnipro. But nonetheless, you start to see a real collapse of the front. And then it forces Ukraine into a dilemma where you have to negotiate from a position of weakness. And also, you could see a real disruption in U.S. material assistance because even though the Biden administration probably shipped a lot of ammunition and other things, that's going to last several months. The United States needs another supplemental package from Congress in order to keep supporting the Ukrainian military. I don't know what this administration intends to do. I don't know what this Congress intends to do. I don't know how much money they anticipate getting or plan to get this year. And so to some extent, Ukraine is also constrained by the support it can expect from the West. We have to keep that in mind. So that situation could break positively or it could break negatively. And then you could see the effects of a lack of assistance as we saw in winter and spring of 2023. If you remember shell hunger, if you remember the fires advantage that Russia was able to establish, might not get that bad, but I'm saying we remember this period because it was literally just last year, the winter and spring of last year. We could come back to a period like that, except this time it'll be decisive because Ukraine's manpower situation is a lot worse. And the situation at the front is a lot worse now than it was back during battle for Avdiivka. So from my point of view, again, worst case scenario is Ukraine is forced to pursue negotiation, but with a much weaker hand. And also the United States is pursuing negotiations, but not from a position of wanting to get the best possible deal for Ukraine, but rather from the position of wanting to end the war and just wanting to end the war in the most expedient way possible, which I hope won't be the case. That's not what I see right now from the Trump administration. I think that right now, where they are is they are trying to find a way to get leverage, as they said, negotiate from a position of strength, but they can clearly see it's going to take time to build. It's obvious to anyone that it's not going to be solved in the next 30 days or even 100 days. Last point, that's a bit of a long answer. I'm a bit worried because I see some folks in Ukrainian political circles maybe believing that the war is just going to end and negotiation is just going to happen and this problem will be solved for them come summer. And then maybe they can go and have elections in the fall. And the fact that the war is on a negative trajectory and the fact that a lot of these things are yet to be decided, and it's not at all clear that the Trump administration is going to find a solution to this war, that they're not properly considering this. right? And that the war is first and foremost a war of Russian aggression, but it's a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's not necessarily going to be a war that the United States is just going to solve, right? Meaning Ukraine is going to have to take onto itself, and it has, but I want to say again, like Ukraine is a big part of the solution. If Ukrainian leadership is not able to stabilize the front, they're not able to solve these big issues. I hope nobody's out there believing that the Trump administration is going to sort of solve the unsolvable and find a way to negotiate a favorable peace, or as Ukraine officially says, a just peace, from a position of military weakness.
I hope that we will have the best case scenario, yes, and commenting the elections. This is like a very interesting situation in Ukraine when the whole nation is against elections and all the civil society is against elections, but still there is a circulation, and I confirm, of these rumors in political circles. But I believe in Ukrainian nation more than in Ukrainian politicians. So that's why I'm thinking that also the acceptance of the whatever will happen during the negotiation depends on nation more than on politicians who are ready or not ready to sign something. And with this note, thank you so much. I hope that we will meet maybe more often than once per year, and to discuss in the second half of the year what changed, what are the views from United States, how the Trump administration tried to solve the issue. And I hope that this year will bring a little bit more positive trends, which will be realized in stability in the region. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I also believe in Ukrainian nation, and I think Ukraine has consistently at least overperformed expectations. That has done better even in gloomy and grim times. And even I, as someone who, at the very beginning of the war, didn't think that Ukraine would win in the opening conventional phase of the war.
I do remember that.
Yeah, very much so, amongst many. I didn't think Ukraine would lose in 3 days. I don't think anybody seriously thought that. Maybe General Milley thought that. But certainly I didn't think that Ukraine would win the opening phase of the war. To be frank, without Western material and intelligence support, I don't know how 2022 would have gone. Let's be honest about that too. But nonetheless, Ukraine has consistently done better than expected. I've learned a lot from what I've seen in the last 3 years. So despite this being a relatively gloomy period, I think there is at least some room for optimism there.
It was a Safe and Safe Country podcast. To listen to the previous episodes and catch up on new one, please find us at Ukrainska Pravda resources, subscribe to our channels on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and other platforms. Safe and Safe Country. It depends on each of us how soon the prefix "on" will disappear. Thank you.